Hello, Vlad. I am the beautiful community. I am the beautiful community, and you're Vlad. And we're going to do a very small live. Now, can Vlad hear me? Because I'm the beautiful community, and I don't really make any sense unless you can hear me. So let's check that out. Loud and clear. So listen there, Vlad. As the beautiful community, I can tell you that we had a floppyfication. Oh, Arsenal are playing. Oh, Daniel, you're saying Arsenal are playing, but aren't they playing? Aren't they playing Burnley? They're going to win. You can watch after. So we have a flopification on the main channel of a video in which I try to summarize what European leaders should do and what blocks they have to overcome. This is just to have a little chat about that video and just to remind a few people that it's out there in case you haven't seen it. Although it's obviously the most ridiculous thing to do because the only people here are definitely the people who would have seen it. What I said in that video, I have no idea whatsoever. But if I remind myself, I said that there were 5 mental blocks that European leaders needed to overcome. And they needed to overcome this kind of intuition trap where you can't quite grasp that something that's inside your house can be a threat because it's inside your house, and America is inside our house. There was a kind of a contagion obliviousness block that I felt European leaders had, which is just not being clear about what the threat is. The threat is not that Trump's going to take Europe over. The threat is that proximity to Trump's misdemeanors accelerate the Trumpification of Europe, organic Trumpification with our own Trumps. The third fallacy is the change fallacy, which is just that there's this subconscious feeling that Trump's going to go, but the problem is he'll go, but the authoritarian threat won't. The fourth block was this kind of aberration fallacy that this will all settle itself eventually. That's how, by the way, we've thought of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We've thought of it as something that will hopefully settle back into the pre-2022 order. But the problem is it's because there was no settled pre-2022 order that we can't get back to it, and that the war started full scale. And the fifth block is a kind of a black box fallacy that's often a really big problem. And that's when European leaders keep asking what Trump wants and what concessions might satisfy him, as though he is somebody who is going to have a coherent position. And he doesn't. Even when he looks inside himself, he doesn't see much, and he doesn't see many coherent positions about anything. And that creates just a defensive posture because you're always responsive to something. And you're responsive to it as though you can't know what it wants, but that there is something that it wants that it would be great if you could discover, but that's not undiscoverable, it's non-existent. And the 9 solutions were articulate Europe's core interests, don't let uncertainty become passivity, halt the collapse of trust, partly at least, at home with clarity and truthfulness in the way you talk about the situation, propose principles for a new global order, even if it feels unreachable. And there we talked about what Mark Carney said, but also what more you should say on top of what Mark Carney said. Understand that weakness, number 5, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And don't be afraid to critique Trump. He does not respect you if you suck up to him. He doesn't like it if you hit him hard, but he doesn't like it if you suck up to him either. And the degree to which European leaders can get away with hitting Trump hard is astonishing relative to their own perception, mistaken perception of how far they can actually get away with it. And the seventh thing is, for goodness sake, think of your career, because it now pays to hit Trump. And as often in politics, things change when it becomes palpably in the career interests of a politician to do something. You often ask me, when are folks within the United States going to do a better job of challenging Trump? And the answer is, you're going to have more Republicans and more Democrats challenging Trump effectively when they realize it's in their career interest to do so. And then I said something really important, unoriginal, but really important. And that's that the shrillness of Trumpian attacks on Europe, the shrillness of that speech Vance gave at the Munich Security Conference, was as shrill as it was, not because they're pissed about us, but because they see us as a threat to their domestic power. In other words, they think of a liberal democratic Europe as a domestic threat to Trumpism within the United States, just the way Putin sees an independent Ukraine as a threat to his power inside Russia. And the ninth thing I said was, use Trump as sparring practice, because you're going to get more authoritarians you're going to need to be dealing with in the future. All right. So this is some of what the video is about. In case there's one or two of you who haven't seen it, see it. So I never, ever, 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 ever these days bet on politics for ethical reasons. Because if I bet on politics, I would need to disclose it and discuss it with you. I'd also need to inevitably end up modeling to you the idea that it's a nice thing to bet on politics, and I'm not sure it is. So I just don't. But once or twice a year, I put on some cheeky, tiny bet on football. And when Arsenal were many, many, many points ahead, I put a tiny, cheeky bet on Manchester City. And then I withdrew it favorably to myself when City leveled and were favourites. And that was great, because now Arsenal are favourites again. So I always felt that Arsenal were going to have a difficult end to the season, even when they were 9 points ahead. So let's rock and roll. Those of you who are watching and somehow still want to be here, can keep me updated about the score. So I'm going to take a few questions, beautiful community. Let's see what we've got. If European leaders distance themselves as much as I want them to from Trump, is that going to change the way, Newtonify is asking, Putin thinks of Europe? Nope. Somebody else asking that question. That's Joseph. I beg your pardon. Joseph, I still think that Putin is going to think that Europe is a pawn controlled by the United States. He doesn't terribly much believe that West European states have agency. And he's not a guy who is good at changing his mind because of empirical evidence pointing out that his previous belief was wrong. So don't forget, he doesn't associate the United States with Trump. He's still scared that Trump is an ephemeral phenomena, will be eaten up by the system and replaced by more Obamas and Hillary Clintons. That's a kind of a nightmare for Putin, and he still thinks that might well happen. In fact, he is kind of split on this. He thinks that there is this historical trend, which means that Western democracy will eventually collapse. But he is also impressed in a way that's paradoxical and double-minded by what he would call the deep state, and he would exaggerate the role of the deep state. Certainly, he deeply understood how constrained Trump was in his first term relative to his second term. But he would exaggerate and over-systematize that. He thinks that there are deeper forces at hand that will sort of digest Trump and then return us to where we were before. So he has these two conflictive thoughts. So he doesn't necessarily therefore think that Europe standing up to Trump is necessarily an anti-American stance, because he thinks that there's a deep state that's anti-Trump. I think the hardest point Newtonify is saying to get across is that um, the world is not going to go back to normal after Trump. Does any of the EU leaders understand this? So I think that cognitively, most EU leaders understand this, but I don't think it has percolated all the way through them. Let's take an extremely elevated and special example. An example of somebody I think is really beautiful and I really adore them, Rory Stewart. Now, in the 2024 election, a few months before, Rory said that he felt that Kamala Harris would win easily. Rory, there is nothing out there to grasp about the social forces causing democratic decline that Rory doesn't understand, that he couldn't even write a book about if he wanted. But yet, he said something that was, in fact, unhistorical, right? He said something that was out of sync with the historical moment. And he said it, and it's not that we can guarantee the results of elections. We don't know. So I'm not saying he needed to say that Trump was definitely good. I wasn't saying that Trump was definitely good. I was saying that Trump was very likely to win in 2024. But I would have been completely happy if somebody had said it's 50-50 as far as I can tell. Nobody knows. That's a perfectly reasonable position. But Rory said Trump was overwhelmingly likely to lose. Kamala would win. And that was unhistorical. And it was not just being out of sync with history, it was being out of sync with the part of him that understood all of the social forces driving democratic decline. So there was this cognitive understanding that wasn't properly physically percolated for Rory. That's, and Rory's been reflecting on that since. That is the state of most European leaders. If you ask them, they can monkey you the right answer. Has it percolated through them? No. And that's why there is this atmosphere in centers of power, not just in political centers of power, but in other centers of power in the NGO sector. This is very dominant. There's an atmosphere of a kind of strange, sort of radioactive gray transitional space where you're floating in something that is a bit alien and sickly because you can't quite place it. It's almost like a space that connects two worlds, but you don't know what the next world is going to be, and you're still sort of you're conscious of this radioactive space, but you basically don't have anywhere you're really comfortable except the previous world, out of which history seems to be transforming, but it's not clear where it's going. That's the feeling. So it's a feeling of deep, deep discomfort and a kind of low yield anxiety that accompanies the cognitive comprehension. And that's because the cognitive comprehension lacks integrity. It hasn't been properly integrated, right? It's something that's sort of sitting on the deck of the ship of the mind. If the mind is a ship, it's not gone to the 9 floors below. That's how it very tendentiously and cartoonishly describe it, Newtonify. What does the untethering of social bonds mean? X Duncool is asking. So abstractly, right, it's your capacity to repeatedly share social space with different kinds of members of your society. Now, of course, one element that's driving this is the internet, right? You're present online, which dramatically transforms the kind of people you interact with. You tend to interact with the kind of people you already agree with online, for instance, um, which is always a battle for us, right? It's one of the reasons this channel has been stuck on whatever it is, 115,000 subscribers for a year, because I'm not saying too many things that are going to grow it. But I know what things would grow it. I know what to say to reinforce the sort of dramatic sense of agreement that algorithms like. Normally, that would be about one direction would be Trump's physical frailty, where I don't go because I don't think that's a strong story right now. And the other bigger direction is the collapse of the Kremlin, the collapse of Putin, right? You can 30x one's 30x one's income and 10x one's views if one does that. So that's what the internet does to us. That's not real. That's not how things work in real life, right? In real life, you're stuck with the people who are in your village, as it were. You can't just befriend one person in the village who's like you, and then multiply them so that everybody you're friends with is like that one person, right? So we have these constellations of entire villages made up of village idiots, because the village idiot of one village gets together and forms a virtual village of village idiots with other idiots from other villages. So that happens to all of us. So the internet is one driving force here. Another driving force is, for goodness sake, inequality and economic disempowerment. The fact that different slices of society no longer interpenetrate at all. Obviously, the infinitesimal number of folks in the billionaire class are an extreme example of it, but it's actually a really difficult, really difficult problem. Because if you never share social space with certain varieties of fellow citizens, you don't really feel you're in a society with them. That's a real problem. There are then various ideologies of self-realization that push us toward very individualistic ways of thinking about what is a good life, and how one spends it, that also pushes against various kinds of social bonds, right? There are also many forms of mobility, including economic mobility, right? Folks not staying where they were born and so on. But there are various kinds of complex factors that mean that we engage much less intergenerationally. It's disturbing the degree to which 20-year-olds are engaging with 20-year-olds, 15-year-olds are engaging with 15-year-olds. That's not okay, right? Aristotle would tell you that's really not okay, either developmentally or civically. So what then happens is that different kinds of people come along, right? Folks who write about the economy, folks who write about social alienation, folks who write about the internet, and then they tell different stories about these different types of unthetherings. But I put it all into one basket because I think it's very important. But if you were to put a single label on it, it's the repetitive sharing of social space with citizens who are different to you, including, for goodness sake, your own family members. Is your full name Vlad, Vladislav, or Vladimir? So, um, the full formal name of Vlad that I was born with is Vladislav, which is typically more of a Polish name. It's much less common in Russia than Vladimir. Um, the short of that, when I was in the Soviet Union in the 1980s until I left in 1990, the short of that was Vladik. The dick part had to be cut off as I moved west. In Israel, I was Vladi, and in the UK, I have just been Vlad. I don't think of Vladislav as, if somebody says Vladislav to me and I am able to walk, which I'm not able to walk, but if I'm able to walk down the street and somebody says, "Hey, Vladislav," I wouldn't turn around to that. I would think there's a Vladislav down the road. So psychologically, I just relate to Vlad, and I'm Vlad on everywhere. So you know, mm, I was also in Tonga. You can't have consecutive consonants, so you can't have VL. So in Tonga, I was Veleti, and now I'm Vlad. I don't mind Vladislav, but it just doesn't psychologically resonate with me because nobody calls me that for 3.5 decades. Rachel's saying COVID dropped a bomb there, and a kind of a double bomb, right? Because one was the social isolation, but the other was actually the more important one was the number of people who got long COVID. And they're still isolating, not because they want to isolate, because they're too sick to do anything, right? I mean, how many humans could be working in my physical health condition predicament, right? Very few. You'd have to have a pretty weird job. So it's only because I have a job, I'm the beautiful community, and I talk to this guy called Vlad on the internet who tunes in for my lives. So it's a weird job. These people don't have a weird job. There's a lot of them. 1 in 200, at least. There's a lot of them, right? Right. In the many millions in the United States, people are screwed out of the employment market, and fixing the illness would be a lot cheaper than the economic loss, even per annum, that we're taking with this hit, getting these people back to being productive. So it's a bit of economic irrationality, but politics is full of short-termist economic irrationality. Yeah, by the way, somebody saying the name sounded Polish. On my genetics report, my Russian has got downgraded recently. 2. Are you ready? Drum roll. 7.5%. Beautiful community. So what a zinger that is for the 1.5 people who write in once a month saying that I have a particular view about something because I'm evil through my Russian genetics. 7.5% Russian. And it was a lot higher before until these things got precise. But it's gone down to 7.5%, beautiful community. So basically, I am almost all from the West Ukrainian and East Polish massive. That is where me is from, basically. Shockingly small level of Russianness, which creates a real problem for people who want to make that claim, because you can't make the claim culturally because I left when I was 9. So then they revert to the genetics, which is obviously this fascistized way of interacting. A few NAFO people unfortunately do that. Not to me. People are very nice to me, but NAFO people sometimes do that. But now I can get out of that too, right? I'm sorry, I'm Ukrainian. And I don't have, I don't feel very Russian, but I obviously feel a bit, if I feel something, I feel a bit Russian. I don't feel Ukrainian at all. I'm 5% Russian and 0% Ukrainian psychologically. But there we go, 7.5%. If it goes down any lower, I mean, it's gonna be a real issue. All right. Thank you for liking and watching the video. It's a bit absurd when a video flops a bit like that video does, because like it's a video addressed to, in part, addressed to European politicians. Policymakers watch the channels, but obviously a video that gets 70 or 80,000 views is not going to impress itself upon anybody's consciousness. So there's a bit of obviously an absurd act to say, do these 9 things and then end up saying them to, 4.5 people. But it's live. And, it's an important conversation to begin having because, as I just said earlier, the blocks are psychological. And funnily enough, even though I say, oh, take these 9 practical steps, the whole video, if you read between the lines, is a sort of psychological nudge rather than a kind of a cognitive correction. It's not a video that really says, oh, guys, you've got this wrong in your analysis. It's a video that says, we've got to shift something psychologically. Vlad, how do you define populism? Populism is going to be defined a little bit differently by different people, and these definitions have to be useful and compatible. So John Gray says that populism is this. In other words, it is the expansion of perceived claims to legitimate discourse and legitimate grievance. So we thought we had this kind of consensus in 1998, but now more questions are being asked, questions that certain centrist technocrats thought was settled. So it's a kind of expansion of discourse. And John, in part, thinks that that got produced by terrible policies of centrist technocrats. So it's funnily enough, it's a type of blowback against policy mistakes by people who oppose populism. So it's got produced by people who dislike it. The way I label populism is compatible with John Gray's view, is by talking about the nature of discourse. For me, the preferable vantage point to look at it is the vantage point of the distinction between public and private discourse. And so what you can have are 2 kinds of trends. You can have private discourse beginning to eat up public discourse, or you can have public discourse beginning to eat up private discourse. So the country I grew up in, the Soviet Union, was a country in which public discourse was eating up private discourse. Public discourse was trying to get people at the kitchen dinner table to speak like they were Communist Party bureaucrats. Today, we've got the opposite. We've got private discourse swallowing up public discourse. That's Trump, right? He doesn't speak like you'd expect a liberal state to speak to itself in general terms. In general, what is important is that neither of these eatings up happens. You want a healthy distance between the two. You don't want them to be too far apart, because then private sentiment is going to be alienated from the state's justifications of its own activities. You don't want it to be too close because that's also unhealthy. And so what we've got now is a situation where, for better or worse, that distance has shrunk for us. And our private um, uh, discourse, our private sentiment is being increasingly mirrored but in the statements of public officials. That's the label I prefer. That's how I cast populism. And on my terms, and also on John Gray's terms, because these are two compatible remarks about the same phenomena, there can be constructive and unconstructive populism. For me, constructive populism is populism that remains constitutional and institutional. Why is Trump's insanity seemingly not hurting Farage that much? There are a lot of viral articles, videos that talk about the collapse of the European um, alt-right, or the European X-right, as I call it. Some people call it far right. I don't love that term, but I don't have a sort of a serious problem with it. I just don't prefer it. I prefer it to, a bit less than the other terms, because I want to emphasize how conservatism has ceased to be conservative. And so that's important for me. And that's why I say ex-conservative, ex-right, not far right. The whole thing is basically a myth, and it's never going to happen. There are a lot of articles and viral YouTube videos which say that the implosion of Trumpism, which is upcoming, right? Trumpism will implode, right? It's not going to be a pretty end for Trump. I don't mean that he'll not finish his term, but his political career will not end resplendently. The implosion of Trumpism and the kind of ugly politicking it gives way to will not dramatically undermine European anti-democratic, ex-conservative political forces. It just won't happen, because they are caused by social forces rather than ideological contagion, right? If you want to give an ideational explanation here, it becomes much more plausible that the one's going to be causing the other. But it's actually primarily caused by social forces, which require a sociological explanation. And because of that, these things don't get blown about in the wind as much as a lot of these articles and videos assume. Oh, you know, Trump's having a bad time. Trump's influencing a lot of the European ex-right, so the European ex-right is going to start to struggle. No, because the causes of the European ex-right is not just some kind of floating about of ideological items, which is happening. We made a video about it. We actually broke it into 3 compartments: fascism, monarchism, and hyper-neoliberalism, might as right politics. But these are not spread by the spread of ideas primarily. They are spread by the spread of ideas, but not primarily. They're primarily driven by social forces, of which we named one category earlier today, the untethering of social bonds. That's why the whole story is a nonsense. And it's partly, I mean, it's not a nonsense. It actually does undermine these people if they relate to Trump closely, and then something unsavory happens to Trump. They're going to be impacted by that. It's not a nonsense in that sense. It says there could be no impact. It's a nonsense in the sense that there is going to be no significant impact on the European wave of this kind of politics. Right? Farage could have a bad month or a bad day. Farage could himself indeed destroy his political career potentially over proximity to Trump. That's implausible but possible, but he'll be replaced because that wave is too powerfully ordained by, you know, recurrent social pressures that aren't going anywhere. And so that fundamental surge in Europe over the course of a decade or two of ex-right politics is not going to be majorly affected by the implosion of an ex-right political project in the United States. So the reason this idea is so popular is because it still buys into the renormalization story. Trump's awfulness will teach Europeans not to vote for their own Trumps. That's how the story goes. And that's just terrible sociology. It's completely implausible. It's plausible if you don't believe in sociological explanation. It's plausible if you think that people vote on the basis of various kinds of intentional states they have that are a product of thoughts they have, and that's it. And I get an email like that several times a day. Vlad, how can you be sure that democratic decline is real? Voters could just change their mind in a year or two and revert back to supporting democratic institutions, right? So what's what's gone wrong there? What's childish there? Not dumb, right? Because you can have a PhD in theoretical physics and think that. Um, but what's childish about that thought? It's that it misses about 70% of historical causation, which is in the realm of social explanation, right? Um, Rather than explanation at the level of things caused by the floating of various ideas. Ideas are powerful. We're not going to deny that, right? I was born in a country that experienced a revolution in 1917 that was to a very large extent driven by ideas. So we're not going to deny that. It's always both and, not either or. Okay, let's take some super thanks. I see Labour, Chester saying, as a conservative masquerading as a left-wing party. I feel like the label ex-left fits them more. They are what I call technocrats, and I call them centrist technocrats. They're not particularly left. They're a blend of center right and center left. The current Labour government. M. Mahaski is saying, how much would it help the US after Trump if they enforced a minimum of 5 parties in that need to be in Congress, so people need to work together? Let me put it like this. I'm going to abstract away from the particular thing you're saying. Institutional change, institutional reform, and institutional supplementation in itself doesn't solve deep problems. It only solves deep problems if it is a product of democratic negotiation, the product of the country talking to itself about itself. If it is systemic, it's not just one reform in one institutional parameter, but it goes wider than that. And then it's 3, part of a national project. So it needs to be something that's debated, something that is multi-pronged, and something that is part of a vision for where the country is going. Short of that, changing things back and forth will give you advantages and disadvantages. It's not going to solve the problem. Are there any similarities between Soviet nostalgia and the type of nostalgia for the 90s and noughties that a lot of Gen Z people have? I always get these things wrong. What are the cutoff years for these things? Let's ask Claude. Gen Z cutoff years. Born 1997 to 2012. Well, these people wouldn't remember any of the 90s or the noughties. So is there something valid about romanticizing that period? Yeah. Is there something potentially pathological about romanticizing that period, just like it's true of any period? Then yeah. So a lot of the pathologies I described in that Soviet nostalgia video on the main channel a few months ago are universal, right? They're not just things that are true about Soviet people missing the Soviet Union, although some of them are. What I would say is that it's a good idea to watch that video for these general mechanisms of nostalgia. So I'm not going to reactivate them. I'm going to say it's a huge thing. Ethical nostalgia is a huge thing in human life. It's always been a huge thing. And it's especially huge for us when we're in a transitional period, when we're feeling anxious and lost. But it's possible to argue that if you're in the West and you're not in the bottom couple of layers of society, you're having a pretty good time. You're having a pretty good time. I think that even though it was already clear that things were going to go south, but the years 2000 till 2010, even 2012 and 2014 were great. One of the factors was that we already had the advantage of the internet without much of the calamitousness of it. Let me give you one example. I'm not going to explain that in detail, but I think online dating life was in a much healthier space in 2010 than it is in 2026. So there is quite a lot to like about that slice of time. I think that it was quite a good period historically. I think the period of the first few years of the 21st century could be argued to be the most happy constellation of different possibilities that modern humans have had. I think it's one of the best decades of all time. So I want to say nostalgia, yes, but also it's an okay time to look back upon fondly. Do you think great political philosophy, Aryan Raj is asking, is a precursor to a successful society and civilization? Vague question, but you're Vlad. So the answer is that we need to slightly adjust the question. Political philosophy never causes a society too strong. Political philosophy tendentiously does not cause. No, not too strong. Political philosophy never causes society to go in a particular direction. in a sort of unidirectional manner, because all of the political philosophy that's caused a great deal of social change was also itself caused by social change, right? So you have society creating the conditions for certain political philosophy work to be done. That work then further transforms society by spitting out its ideas back into society. So practice causes reflection, and reflection causes practice. Again, I think I quoted this line in the one of the last lives, but Charles Taylor wrote two really important books. One is Sources of the Self, 1989, and A Secular Age, 2004, which remains the most important book about who we are and where we've come from, the most important philosophical book with an intellectual history bent of the century still. So the causal arrows go both ways, and that's what Charles Taylor says in Sources of the Self. Are you at all optimistic about Andy Burnham? Andy Burnham does constitute an improvement. Thank you, beautiful sweetheart. My partner Jane is back from America. She's been in America for 2 months. It's her first trip for work in 3 or 4 years, because she's been working but also too sick to work properly. So she's been working from home for the BBC and has not directed any films in 2 or 3 years. But she's made her first trip. She was really sick on it, but the fact that she got through it is amazing. Let's see what she brought. Oh. It's tea. Yeah. So Andy Burnham, Rachel, is an improvement on Keir Starmer. Not as a person. I'd probably rather be friends with Keir than Andy, compatibility-wise. But as a prime minister, yes, an improvement. Is it a significant improvement? No. Does Andy Burnham have the capacity to address the challenges of the age? No. So am I in a major way optimistic about Andy Burnham? No. I think that the situation the Labour Party is in is very, very painful and very sad. It's a situation where it does not have answers to the challenges it faces. Andy Burnham is more articulate about what it means to have these answers. But he does not have, short of some kind of unbelievable growth, he does not have the capacity to do this on a national level. Nobody in Labour has this capacity, which is why this challenging time is as challenging as it is for the Labour Party. They've got a lame duck leader who can't carry on beyond a certain period of time, but Keir Starmer has to go. And they don't have anybody to replace him. Is Andy Burnham the best candidate? Yeah, it looks like that. But that doesn't mean he has the answers the historical moment requires. It just means he's closer to that than anybody else who is currently visible. So I'm melancholy about the Labour Party. The Conservatives are not in a good way either in the UK. So we really do have two major parties in disarray. Is Mamdani a populist? Of course he's a populist, yes. He bridges very strongly public discourse with private sentiment. In my sense, he's a populist. Is he also a populist in John Gray's case, that he does this to discourse? Yes, absolutely. It's shocking, Rachel, how little Trump is hurt by his own screw-ups, let alone Trump's screw-ups. He's profoundly unhurt by his own propensity to do things that would get other politicians into trouble. So unfortunately, he is still, in a position that Labour politicians can only envy when it comes to prospects at the next general election. How ill is Putin? He is not presenting himself in the active way he did just a few years ago. I suspect COVID to be a fact in addition to other conditions. I think he's pretty healthy. So one investigative team seems to have shown that he was for a while accompanied by thyroid oncologists. But you also must understand how many relatively benign ways of having thyroid cancer there are. So my guess is that Putin's looking healthy. Family genetics are pretty good. So I don't think that we should be surprised if he makes it to his mid-90s. He's certainly got better medical care than anybody in this discussion. I don't see any evidence of any significant health problems. I don't see much beyond just what I've mentioned. And what I've mentioned is potentially not very serious. So the real answer is we don't know. But if you ask me to lean one way or another, is this a guy who's got 3 or 4 years, or is this a guy who's got 20? I'm going to lean 20. As fragile as life is, and we can never predict anything. Why do we never talk about psychopaths in politics? So I feel like I do. I spend more time talking about narcissists because I think that they're harder to understand. I think that we have a better understanding of sociopaths and psychopaths. Some narcissists are psychopaths, of course. Can Europe be geopolitically anti-American and still maintain its current liberal democratic EU configuration? Europe would not be being anti-American. Europe would be being, according to my recommendation, anti a particular kind of politics, whether America has it or not. If we accept Fat Nose as saying that the old world is dead, what should leaders be steering us toward? Have we peaked in terms of world stability for the foreseeable future? Yes, we definitely have. It's very important that you don't deny, first of all, that we are in a rupture. It terrifies humans when they're in a rupture and people around them in power deny that. So very straight communication is really important, number one. Number two, you begin to frame the future. And again, the substance of the stuff I said in the main channel video is less important than the kind of gestures what I was saying was implying. A lot of what I was saying was about say something to frame a future, even if you don't know what it looks like. Try to begin conceptualizing it, begin to have that conversation, right? What are Europe's key needs and interests? This is not entirely clear in this transitional historical moment. Try to name them, right? What kind of world order would we have ideally going forward, right? Well, this is difficult because we're in a global state of untethering as well. But what principles could be important, right? Sovereignty is going to have to be important. Um, Something like the indivisibility of sovereignty is going to have to be important too, because you can make the collective case that if my sovereignty is insecure, then your sovereignty is insecure too. So the substance here doesn't matter. It's that you're saying things about which direction you want the world to go into. That's one of the problems with what happened in Ukraine, right? Russia invaded full scale, but the West and Ukraine and the Russian opposition had nothing to say about what kind of world we are moving toward. And therefore, there was no direction in which to massage the conflict. And so the West attitude came to be, let's do 6 more months of semi-supporting Ukraine. And we've ended up in a very difficult situation where things could turn out very badly for Ukraine, indeed, and for Russia. But this is the other problem in our thinking. These are not mutually exclusive things. Um, Russia and Ukraine could be in a catastrophic place 10 years from now, both, right? So they can both lose. In fact, they're on course to both lose. So why was this not better guided by Western powers? Because there's no vision of where it is guided to. Dear France, dear Germany, dear UK, why are we supporting Ukraine? Where is this? What are we trying to shape? So we support Ukraine to what end? What's going to be the security arrangement we're working toward? What's going to be the state of European politics we're working toward? Right now, the same questions are arising about Ukraine in the European Union. So on the one hand, it's a great idea to fast track Ukraine into the European Union. On the other hand, if Ukraine is not ready, it could hurt Ukraine and the European Union to fast track it too rapidly. Um, and it could also destabilize the European Union because it's fodder for irresponsible political actors if Ukraine is brought in without being ready. So how do you weigh this? And I'm a fan of trying to speed Ukraine into the EU, but how do you weigh this? You weigh this relative to some kind of picture of where we're all going, but we don't have that. I mean, I've been talking about it. That's a problem because you can't take particular decisions proactively and decisively if they are not secondary to any big picture vision of where you're trying to shift international arrangements. One of the reasons Ukraine didn't get supported more, there are other reasons, of course, but one of the reasons Ukraine didn't get supported more was that there was no vision about what level of support was necessary to achieve what aims in the wider sense that goes wider than just keeping the Russians out. And the West was completely inarticulate about this, still is, and Ukraine was completely inarticulate about this, right? Now, that's more understandable, but it's not that they're immune from that criticism, right? The Zelensky administration has failed to propose any future vision of a global order and relied on vacuous moralistic language that's identical to the language of the Russian opposition for the first 2 years of war. And so they were also themselves complicit in this complete strategic disorientation of the West. Right? It's very tough to criticize a country in defensive existential war, right? It's a very big qualifier here. But That largely applies, to be fair, just to outsiders like us. If you're Ukrainian, you can more easily. So this is a problem, and this is why this culture is very important of trying to conceptualize a future. Even if we can't reach it, even if the conceptualization is preliminary, it's very, very important to do this. And because we're not doing it, we're clinging on to a world that we know is melting away. And the Gramscian quote I put in, the famous Gramscian quote I put into the main channel video about an old world dying and the new world not being born is of the essence of the situation we're facing. Rob Marshall, I'm 23. I'm furious that I was not born in the 80s or 90s. Incredibly jealous. Don't be so jealous because you're young. You've got so much phenomenology ahead of you. And thirst for phenomenology is the number one human instinct. We want every extra day. You've got all the extra days. Make something of them. And also, when I spoke a little bit loftily about the 2000 till 2010 period, the truth is that we're still in a good period historically. It's just that we used to be in a very good period historically recently, and we've gone down a notch or two. But what you are going to experience as a Western citizen is going to be really in the top 1% of historical experience. It's just not going to be in the top 0.3%. That's the difference. So it's still extremely privileged historically. So, Thucydides would think that you're a crybaby with your comment, because he'd say, pull yourself together, right? Imagine devastating war and a devastating plague at the same time, with a cumulative fatality rate of up to 50%, right? You're not in that situation. You're very privileged. Also, are you healthy, right? Now, it's not good to relativize, because you can always find somebody in a worse position than you, even if you're in a bad position. But, my partner came back from America today, and I drove out to the roof to sit with her for 5 minutes in my wheelchair, and that was hard for me. And, I can't even use the wheelchair properly. So I'm just heartbreaking how sick you are, right? You can walk, which is amazing, right? You're healthy to be up and about. You're healthy to play or to work most of the day. So perspective and gratitude, please. What exactly is a political project? A political project is, in the way I've intended it in the last few chats, is in the space of national politics, is a proposal, right, for what the country should look like, that is sensitive to human nature and the particular expression of human nature in particular cultural circumstances. Obviously, that kind of nonsense shouldn't be articulated by politicians, but I can say that nonsense. And is also then tied to concrete policy proposals that are actionable. They're not just vague rhetoric that will just fully expire once you reach power. And then there is another condition, that this proposal is articulable nationally. It's not just a certain demographic or a certain group able to talk about it. The country is able to talk to itself about it fairly well. Cheryl is saying the pandemic brought about the habit of social isolation. Yeah, it did. But more bigly, it also got a lot of people sick, and they've ended up being socially isolated. The numbers are big, so we mustn't forget that too. There's always a few of those in any chat that we're in, right? There's a few people in this room right now who cannot work because they got COVID 3 or 4 years ago and they've got long COVID. There's a few of us in this room like that. This is not a big room. And yet, there's a few. Who's up to the challenge? I want to do a video maybe called The Anti-Trump or something like that. And I want to paint a politician who can do this. I can't see one easily in the West. That's why I gave such a lame answer. Arsenal won 1-0. Graham? Okay. My sister is an Arsenal supporter. And her partner's an Arsenal supporter. I would have, yeah, I was happy to win, but it would have been funny to see them sweat a bit if Arsenal drew into the last match of the season a bit more. So I don't see any politicians in any major Western countries or currently in power who are the right kind of blend. I think we're still 5 years away from a conveyor belt that's functional and can produce politicians like that. I'm not a pessimist. Yeah, I think we'll produce them, but we're still 5 years away. We're still in this transitional period. People are not ready. People are not quite getting it in sufficient numbers. We're in between worlds. So we need it now, but that conveyor belt will start working a bit better 5 years from now. That's the reality. What would it look like? It won't look like Zoran. It will look like a blend of Zoran and other political elements, including some right-wing elements. We're not quite getting these constructive blends yet, but they'll come. We're still using all the tools. That kind of retooling will happen, and you're going to see a conveyor belt of politicians more ready for the age by the beginning of the next decade. The trouble is that their enemies, their equivalents of our Trumps, are going to be much better organized and much more dangerous. But at least they will be better tooled up. They'll be tooled up better than the current ones. So just as I say that the authoritarians will get more hard-nosed and disciplined, so I say that our conveyor belt of constructive politicians will improve a bit. Because at the moment we've got just a clown show, quite frankly, of people who are, sort of specimens that fit a 2005 world, but not a 2026 world. Vlad, any opinions on consuming the art of people with problematic positions or pasts? Yes. It's different whether it's art or whether it's entertainment. If it's art and it's good art, it's nothing. In other words, you can avoid it if that's how life works for you and you prefer that, but there is absolutely no objective need for other people who are okay to engage to shun it, right? I mean, think of Gesualdo, right? A great composer from half a thousand years ago. The guy was a bloody axe murderer. Right? Is that going to undermine my enthusiasm for his revolutionary chromatic writing? No, not at all. It's no different than if he were the nicest man on earth. It can be tricky. So, for example, I would call Woody Allen's films the pinnacle of entertainment. Whereas Ingmar Bergman's films, Woody Allen's hero, are art. For me, there is an ethical difference. I think that if you find the person problematic, as I do with Woody Allen, it's easier to find the films problematic. Um, mm, with Ingmar Bergman, it would be completely alien to me. If Ingmar Bergman were a murderer, I'd still watch his films. So when it's art and good art, I think that that gap is very big. It's very difficult to nail something down for ethical inadequacy, especially if it's already in the past and the person is dead. Most of the closest people in my life have, for example, stopped watching Woody Allen because of their ethical sensibilities. Would they have stopped watching Ingmar Bergman the same way? I don't think so, actually. I don't know. I certainly wouldn't. So I don't need Beethoven to be a well-adjusted person or a good member of his family, a good step dad, a good a parent figure, which he certainly wasn't, to greatly admire pretty much every bar he produced. So it's always an ongoing conversation. I'm going to do a video about it on the Philosophy channel at some point because it's a great question. It arises viscerally with particular people. In the realm of painting, of course, it viscerally arises with Gauguin. With Gauguin, you have essentially grotesque objectification of underage females in his lesser works, but his greater works transcend it, not by backing out of that kind of gaze, but by going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and making an art of it. One way for great art to overcome a problem is to go forward in it rather than coming back out of it. And so Gauguin's greatest masterpieces are totally pure. There is no but to them. So when the wonderful philosopher Martha Nussbaum says that the best works from the Tahiti periods are ethically compromised, she's wrong. They're not ethically compromised at all. If you want a guide to this, as a general way of thinking about it, read. Can I type? Read Bernard Williams's piece on Wagner in the New York Review of Books, where he talks about how to deal with Wagner's greatness. No, I'm not going to go Pinker on anybody because Steven Pinker takes a view of a very scientific kind of important questions that I very much resist. Why has the EU proved more durable than NATO? Chester is asking. It hasn't. Both are in decline. It hasn't. Yeah, I'm terribly, terribly allergic to cats. In a past life, a former partner of mine had 6 cats. At one point, I considered getting those injections that reduce cat allergy, but I never did. Eventually, I just gave up on that. So I remain allergic to cats, even though I'm much more cat than dog. I'm much more a cat person than a dog person. How should we think about the technocratic centrist successes? Um, a funny example of technocratic success is the management of the Russian economy. The Russian economy is extremely well managed. It's managed by people, some of whom don't really feel they're for or against the Putin regime. They're just there to manage the Russian economy. So there's a lot that we are going to miss, um, uh, that technocratic centrism gave us, because we're going to get all of these people in power who are going to be completely, ineffectual, like Trump is. So, uh, yeah, we'll certainly miss procedural competence, because these folks are going to attack institutions, they're going to attack civil services, which are a very important part of procedural adequacy in governance. Does the decline in culture always precede the decline of democracy? Now, obviously, there are two types of culture you can talk about. You can talk about culture in the sense of high culture. I think that's just a separate question. If you mean how healthy the political culture is, yeah, I mean, there are two bits to this conversation. One is uh, how strong is your civic democratic culture, and the other is how strong are your institutions. Um, and you need both for democracy to survive. Um, but because democracy is partly about strong institutions and partly about a healthy democratic culture, the question you're asking is a bit is semi-tautological, because um, the decline of democracy just is in part the decline of democratic culture. They're the same thing. They're different words for the same thing in part. Jamie, with a fractured West, with Europe and America drifting apart into a cold transitional relationship over the next 30 years, should we expect pro European and pro Atlantic swings here in the UK? I don't imagine thinking of it as swings really matter, really helps, because it's not going to be the case that there are clear and appealing centers to swing in between, to swing between. Um, the European Union is in decline, and the United States is in toxic crisis, that could border on low-grade civil war. So uh, there aren't powerful visions in either direction to appeal to. What I think the center and the left needs to do is to make a much more pragmatic pro-European argument that doesn't deny any of the grievances of uh, citizens who voted Brexit. Let's have a look. won't be that rosy about the future with the effect of climate change, Rob Marshall is saying. Climate change is going to be really bad um, as it develops over the coming decades, but it's not going to be catastrophic for most Western citizens. It's still going to be a minority of Western citizens who are caught up in extreme life-altering climate events. There's going to be more of those, right? Many, many more wildfires, for instance, um, much more flooding. Um, but the way most people are going to be affected is not through um, any kind of unlivable conditions coming to obtain, as they will in other parts of the world. They won't in the West. You know, your experience of it is going to be more that um, democratic institutions are even more greatly stressed by the climate crisis. Supply chains are going to be wonky and partly breaking. So you're going to have exposure to diseases as well that was not there before. So there'll be changes of a very challenging kind, public health changes, uh, uh, f- food security changes, challenges. But the majority of Western citizens will not be in a catastrophic predicament the way people in parts of the Middle East will be. Are Trump voters wrong? Are they irrational? Um, Yes and yes about much, but I don't think that's the central thing to identify. The central thing to identify is the loss of trust, not the misinformation or epistemic error. So you see it as a thirst for political agency rather than a propensity for intellectual error. You take a dim view of people's intelligence generally. Why then support democracy so emphatically, trying to square your democratic leanings against the Nietzschean aristocratic bent? Um, so, Nietzsche is the greatest moral philosopher of the past 150 years, 170 years. Nietzsche has nothing to do with the question of whether most humans know what they're doing. It's a very banal question, and you don't need to read any philosophy to take a view on it. Um, so the answer is really twofold why there is absolutely no connection. First of all, it's because of the way I love people. I'm just not very misanthropic at all. Um, there are sensibilities who love people less if they perceive people as being sort of ludicrously victimized by various kinds of delusion and pathology. Um, I don't feel that at all. There is no degradation in my love for human beings, even though I see that we are farcical in many ways. Um, so that's one thing, right? I don't have that sensibility that you're ascribing to me. It's a separate question whether it's fair to ascribe it partly to Nietzsche. Um, Nietzsche wasn't a Democrat. politically. But then Nietzsche wasn't a political philosopher. He just didn't think much about politics. He just didn't think much in political categories, and he hardly at all thought in sociological categories. I mean, he's just not good at all at social explanation. He's a genius of moral psychology. So seeing us as we are does not degrade my love of us. I don't need us to be something we're not to love us. That's why I don't feel depressed when I look out into the political world. Number one. Number two, politics isn't a matter of that kind of sensibility. Politics is centrally a question of legitimacy. And the problem is that in the modern world, you don't just have to justify power to every person. You have to justify, you don't just have to justify power, you have to justify power to every person. There's this special inclusiveness in the way we inevitably think of legitimacy in the modern world. And so that means that some model of democracy is a precondition for a legitimate society in the modern world, I'm afraid to say. You just can't justify yourself to your citizens properly without that. So you can get, therefore, to a very, very minimal justification of a roughly democratic way to run your society with some counter-majoritarian institutions, just in virtue of reflecting on modernity plus sort of elementary rationality of human cooperation. That's enough to get you there. So the idea of denying that is just not a starter in the modern world, because you have to justify power to each single person. And you can't really do that unless you have at least a somewhat democratic government. So that's the political answer. And then the aesthetic answer is that the temperament you ascribe to me is just completely alien to me. There's no connection between aesthetic or intellectual elitism and wanting people to be politically excluded. I mean, just think about that. Why should we exclude Ricky? Because Ricky doesn't enjoy reading Aristotle? Are you serious? Why should we exclude Ricky? Well, because Ricky runs this NGO, but actually Ricky's got bad leadership skills and Ricky should be a number 5, not a number 1. What, exclude Ricky from are you serious? From political participation? It's just a crazy idea. It's a completely crazy idea. Just like it would be a completely insane idea for us to argue for something like a kind of a plural voting where some people have 100 votes and other people have 1. It's very difficult to square that with modern conceptions of legitimacy. So the idea that a professor of moral philosophy should have more votes than a bus driver is not so much morally disgusting to me as laughable. And the moral philosopher, the professor of moral philosophy at Harvard or Oxford will not always, and maybe not most of the time, but will sometimes and often enough lose out in political judgment to the bus driver. The bus driver will be better at politics in some respects than some professors of politics at Princeton. They might have better political judgment. That doesn't mean they're going to be better at being a professor of politics than a professor of politics. Of course not, because a professor of politics can give a beautiful lecture about John Locke. So that's not a complete sort of undermining zing of the professor of politics, but um, the idea that that person should have more votes than the bus driver is a completely farcical idea to modern eyes. Literally Ben White. Hi Vlad, won't stick around as I've just had a heart attack watching Arsenal play. I thought it'd be 1-0. I thought it'd be 1-0. I would watch quite a bit of football if my health were better, but as it is, I haven't watched a single full football match in 2026. So it's only for health reasons. Is woke a form of Gramscian cultural hegemony? Um, Woke is a combination of elite circles striving for power advantage with a kind of distortion of liberal principles of inclusion driven by a corrupt application of a benign value, the value of authenticity. What are your views on the likes of Varoufakis? They're happy to criticize the US and EU, but not Russia. It's all the West's fault. Um, well, I think Yanis Varoufakis thinks very different things about different topics. I think that he did an event in Russia recently where they wrote or played a song about him in the most humiliating way. And so he walked on stage to Yanis Varoufakis. So yeah, Yanis's views about the Russia-Ukrainian war just don't give a good account of why the war started and what the Kremlin is doing. It's very important that we often risk giving the West too much agency in everything, right? We've got to give the Kremlin agency here. That's one of the problems with a lot of the pro-Kremlin positions. They don't give the Kremlin enough agency, and that's partly because their positions. I'm not saying that's the case with Yanis. I think his mistake lies elsewhere, but it's partly because these positions on all of these conflicts often emanate out of our culture wars, right? So a lot of debates about Russia, Ukraine are not debates about Russia, Ukraine at all. They are just gambits in, let's say, US domestic culture war. I just had a consulting client tell me a story about how they were speaking to somebody pro Putin. They were giving the sort of it's called by caused by NATO story, and my clients really discombobulated them because they said, but do you really think that Putin is that stupid? You're severely underestimating Putin's intelligence here. And apparently the other person couldn't answer. That often is a demonstration of the fact that these are domestic culture war gambits with um, Ukraine and Russia being just props that are used in the course of that. Russia only invites countries not in NATO. Give it 5 years. Coin toss. Coin toss that gets assumption gets challenged. Can we just mention Epstein to keep things current? Well, yes. I mean, don't underestimate how that motivates a lot of what Trump still says and does. Arthur, how about a basic test to show your knowledge of the candidates and their actual platforms in order to vote? No, because you can't design that test in a way that is itself going to be entirely politically neutral, you see? The test itself is obviously going to be a legitimate object of political contestation. Unless you can immunize it from that, which you obviously can't, um, you can't do it. There's no good philosophy of the social sciences seminar, in other words, in which you'll be able to get away with the claim that you can come up with a neutral test of knowledge. And you might say, yes, I can. And the answer is going to be, no, you can't. When is it justifiable for a voter to be led by their destructive tendencies and vote to stimulate change? Understandable sometimes, justifiable never, because destructive tendencies never securely stimulate constructive change. Don't forget, destructive tendencies is not trying to shake things up, it's having toxic, dark, pathological feelings which lead you to act politically in a certain way. So if you just mean shake things up and sit in the living room, have a cup of tea, and have everybody's best interests at hand, and then decide to shake things up, that's not destructive behavior. That's good or bad political behavior, depending on the circumstances. But destructive behavior is the dispensation of some kind of impulse that is pathological. They'll talk about compulsory voting. This is again one of those questions where I'm a fan of compulsory voting, tendentiously in countries which don't have it. But if you're going to do it, you need to do it plus other reforms and package it into a big story about where you're moving the country. Fat Nose is asking, the new war strategy is that the Iran war is all about spread of destructive ideas to other nations. Fat Nose claims, in a connected world, inevitably many of these ideas will come back. Has this happened? It's less about ideas spreading, although that's true too, and more about disinhibition, right? I stole Rachel's sparkling water, and other people saw that, and they now think, well, I could steal somebody's sparkling water as well. Hi, Vlad. I wrote a very honest critique of a terrible essay by a professor in a clinical psychology um, department who went the route of geopolitical realism. I'm not an academic, but I feel my critique is fitting. Submit it. If you're trying to submit it to an academic journal, check who they take it from. But some will take it from anybody at all, because as long as it goes through the blind review process, they don't care. They don't care who you are. If you wanted to go to an academic place. Probably too big for a topic for today. Am I worried about AI? Yes, I'm worried about AI. I'm worried above all about the politics that is needed but really hard to attain um, um, at the level of international collective cooperation to keep AI from all kinds of destructive directions. Mearsheimer's takes on Iran worth listening to. So I have an opinion some of you are not going to like. I think Mearsheimer is terrific to listen to, also in Ukraine and Russia, because he's calm. He's a very clear enunciator of his ideas. And he's just very, very healthy for you to engage with, because he is very transparent in how he speaks. So, for instance, I think that his account of the Russo-Ukrainian war is a bunch of baloney, but he is such a clear and systematic and articulate speaker that it's very, very healthy for you to engage with what he says, because you can test your own opinions very effectively that way, and you can also uh, very easily make counter arguments to him because of the transparency and the clarity of his position. So I actually think he is very constructive to engage with intellectually for people. If you said to me, "Well, Vlad, give me somebody who you think takes the wrong view on the Russo-Ukrainian war to listen to, so I can sort of think about how I might rebut them," I would say, try Mearsheimer, because it's not going to be good to listen to somebody who's just completely all over the place and says this and that and that and this. So he is somebody who allows you to disagree with him very effectively. Why is Mearsheimer so pro-Russian? Um, there are several reasons here, but one of them is that, and I am planning a massive video on Mearsheimer just once I get the main channel going a bit. I'm hoping to post there more often, so keep giving the love to the main channel. Um, Putin started the Ukraine war for domestic regime security reasons, mainly. He also had national security reasons, but they were not realist reasons of the kind Mearsheimer thinks of. They were much more to do with certain mystical visions of escalation. And so Mearsheimer's account of the relations between states is simply inarticulate about why Putin started that war. It just doesn't fit. And so you get a kind of evacuated rationalization of Putin that I think misses the psychological substance and consequently the causal substance. So that's absolutely a central and indeed the central reason. On John Mearsheimer's terms, what happened there doesn't happen. Now, Mearsheimer might say, well, there's all kinds of ways of fudging the edges of my theoretical claims, and things can sometimes go differently. So there is some room to make this the case. This is tendentiously true, but not true in every case. Blah, blah, blah. But essentially, his theory is simply inarticulate about the kinds of things that led Putin to war. Um, there are other reasons, but that is the central mistake. Why are academics like Mearsheimer anti-Ukraine and pro-Palestine? I think I can't take that, you see, as a generalization. It depends. Um, certainly, Ukraine. Oh, by the way, I did promise that when I released my main channel video, which wasn't the Mooch video, it was the yesterday's video, that I would then do the long Israel Gaza chat. So Israel Gaza will be one of the next 2 or 3 chats on the chat channel now. In the among Ukrainians and among the Russian opposition, there's a kind of an absolute blindness about the agency of Palestinians. Also, on average, Americans are worse at seeing the agency of Palestinians than Europeans are. So, I suppose the answer to that question depends on what you have in mind when you're pointing to a discrepancy. If you're saying if he's pro-Palestinian, why can't he be pro-Ukrainian? Then you could take that argument some way. But I think that there is a mix. There are certainly a lot of people who are clamped in the pro-Russian, pro-Palestinian position. There are a lot of people in the pro-Ukrainian, pro-Palestinian position. So it's a wash. So I think that it's an easier question why Mearsheimer takes a certain stance, right? Then why lots of people do, because lots of people are clamped and arranged in different ways on different positions for different reasons. The big asymmetry there with Mearsheimer is that it's hard for him theoretically to be articulate about why Putin is acting the way he does. But you can begin to point real contradictions and challenges there for John Mearsheimer. Namely, John Mearsheimer recognizes that Netanyahu is partly fighting a regime security war. Netanyahu partly wants to fight Iran and partly started a war on Hamas that became a war on the people of Gaza. It became a war on civilians because he wants to maintain power. John? John? Hello? John? The same thought? Can we just move it 2,000 kilometers, please? It does apply. Try it. It's going to be good. It's going to work. It works. John, it works. So there's a problem there. Because he accepts regime security causes of war in the case of Israel, but rejects them in the case of Russia. Vlad, strange question, but what do you think about um, unidentified aerial phenomena? When I was living in Israel, I was living in Haifa between 1990 and 1990, early 94 when I moved to the UK. I was obsessed with military aviation to the point that it still sometimes helps me a little bit when I watch the news because I still vaguely, even though I'm getting too far out of date, I'm still vaguely aware of what kind of missiles a fighter plane is carrying and what they can or can't do. That can sometimes help actually because very often the state claims it's doing something, and then you see the technology it's flying, and you straight away realize that they cannot possibly be truthful in what they're saying they're doing because the things they're using don't do the thing they say they're doing. I've mostly lost that a bit. I was obsessed with military aviation. I thought about it for hours a day. Um, and I thought about American military aviation mainly and Russian secondarily. Um, I spent a year, even though I'm not, um, uh, I don't in any way identify with being Jewish. I'm not Jewish in any psychological way, but I spent a year in an ultra orthodox school in Israel where I had to pray twice a day for like 40 minutes. Um, and I got into trouble there. There was corporal punishment in that school. I got into trouble for drawing a fighter jet with an American flag on it because they needed the Israeli flag on it. I got into trouble for it with a teacher who used to spank people with a ruler. And so, because I was constantly looking at the sky and thinking about the sky, once something very rare happened to me, which is I saw something in the sky that I couldn't recognize. I was 10. And I thought, well, could this be a flying saucer? And the next day, there were newspaper reports of people reporting of a UFO. I still thought it was some very weird bit of military tech that was weirdly illuminated or some weather condition interacting with it. But I was freaked out because I could recognize everything in the sky. Right? I could recognize just from looking at it for 2 seconds on a photograph every kind of missile that the West or the Soviet Union used on planes. Couldn't recognize that. So, now, are aliens actually visiting Earth? No, they're not. What are the chances that aliens are actually visiting Earth in spacecraft? Are they 10%? No, they're much lower than 10%. Are they 5%? No, they are lower than 5%. Are they 1%? No, they are lower than 1%. Is any publicly available account of the existence of aliens as visitors to Earth compelling enough to shake that epistemic placement? Not even remotely. And yes, I did spend 7 hours listening to Joe Rogan podcasts about aliens some years ago. But no, there is nothing that I'm aware of that persuades me to think of this as anything other than a very near zero scenario. I'm not talking about the existence of aliens in general. I'm talking about whether they're visiting us today in spacecraft. But they might come tomorrow, and then this would be my first catastrophic error of prediction. What's seemingly something seemingly mundane that you find miraculous? I just missed this question. I haven't found anything like that recently because in life, because I find a lot of art miraculous, but I don't find it mundane. So I suppose when I was a child, I found it. I think this was asked already. Did you ask it on the last live? Um, and did I answer it? I'm having a deja vu moment. I would say that when I was a teenager and I realized that you didn't just have talent or lack it, you could also develop your talent for developing your talent. That was a miraculous thing to me, even though it was quite a basic thing to realize. It also felt miraculous to me. Um, well, the root causes of democratic decline, very briefly, are summed up in a screenshot that appears for 2 or 3 seconds in my latest main channel video yesterday. I'll put them tomorrow also on um, Substack, but they need to be elaborated upon. These are the 4 or 5 things I constantly mention. They need to be elaborated on for a proper account, of course. And your interview with the Mooch was extremely helpful. I have ADHD um, with severity about to the same extent as Trump. The first time describing Trump's communication as genius made a tiny bit of sense to me. Yeah, he is a communicator of an absolutely awful standard, um, but he's also a communicator of genius. He's both. I don't have any thoughts on Navarra media um, journalism. I don't think it's journalism; it's commentary. Um, I'm sure I've heard some great discussions on Navarra media. I'm sure I've heard some less than great discussions. Um, so I sometimes tune in, but probably not that often, given the extreme health-based time restrictions for me. What makes you happy, Vlad? First thing that comes to mind, Beethoven's De Belli Variations. Okay, let's do a couple more minutes. Somebody's got a Ukrainian Su-24 as a model plane. I promise I'll do, Alex. I promise. Alex is asking about this business of the talent for developing your talent. I promise I will do a chat about it, maybe here or maybe on the Philosophy Channel. It's a very, very important concept. The reason it's so important is because society gives us fewer resources to be okay with death. We have to make ourselves be okay with death in the modern world. And the best way of doing that is to live a life in which your own talents are maximally realized. So this is a very important conversation that actually has indeed even spiritual dimensions. Hey Vlad, couldn't you join the main account and the chat account somehow? Some people always do the and thing now. Every post is it. So that doesn't do much. So if I attach I might as well do it tonight. If I attach the chat channel to my main channel video, it will just show the video to like a couple of people from my chat channel. It won't really affect the traffic much. It's shocking how little the collaborations do. They're good, but um, if you compare the notion of launching a video on both channels with launching it on the main channel and adding as a collaborator the chat channel, that second option is virtually identical to just launching it on the main channel. It does very little. Um, it's not that all of you folks are suddenly going to see it. So I do have, this is absolutely bizarre, but I genuinely do have a good number of people who have no idea the chat channel exists. Well, most of the subscribers to the main, many of the subscribers to the main channel don't, because it's got twice bigger subscribership. But also some people on chat have no idea that the main channel exists. And a lot of people also watch both, but they don't know that there is more than one. They just see something, Vlad, okay, I'll watch that. So it is the way it is. I am not sure if I would have done it that way round again, but I think the main benefit of the chat channel is that this is a space where we've got the same people over and over and over and over and over coming back to talk, or at least to listen, at least to be provoked, to be scared, to be reassured. So all of that is important, I think. I think there's something algorithmically dead and weird in a good way also about the chat channel. People are saying to me, Vlad, how could you even succeed, even if you tried? How did you succeed to stay on like 116,000 for a year, having made a video almost every day? How is that even possible? And it's possible because the whole thing is not positioned to push to a new audience, and the algorithm has now learned that quite excessively, to the point that it doesn't even do minor growth. So there's a lot of advantage to that, but it also means we're blah, 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 blah. Well, you get the picture. So no, there is no easy way to just send everyone from the main channel here and everybody from chat to the main channel. Collaboration makes that a bit easier, but not by much. Okay, let's take one last question, and then we're going to be good. Why is Trump enabling Putin so obviously by renewing the sanctions waiver against Russian oil? Why Trump submits to Putin video, I do feel covers the main elements of that. It's a big video from a year ago. It's got 500,000 views. I say the main spiel there about his dependence on narcissistic dependence on Putin. So the last question is from Daniel. Is any Iran peace deal compatible with Trump's narcissistic needs? Trump has stopped narcissistically benefiting from the Iran war a long time ago. It's now a net negative for him. It's not a source of narcissistic supply. Whether he's going, the way he narcissistically tolerates a bad peace deal is partly by telling himself that it's good, and partly by migrating his pursuit of narcissistic supply elsewhere. So, to put this very briefly, Trump is going to need a next thing, unfortunately. You are Vlad. I am the beautiful community. Thank you very much for being with me. We're going to talk soon. And the few of you who've been anticipating, watch out, health allowing, we're doing, whenever the next 2 or 3 chats come, one of them will be on Israel, Gaza, and it'll be long. Lots of love. Catch you later.